Rook stopped at the cider house door and would not cross it, not because he was frightened, because someone inside was. Caleb Rowan found a 70-year-old woman dragging a crate of winter apples across the floor with one hand, while the other clutched a worn green ledger against her chest. When her sleeve slid back, finger-shaped bruises circled her wrist. Then headlights slowed on the county road outside, and the woman whispered, almost without sound, "Please don't tell them I'm here." For the first time since coming home, Caleb understood why his dog had refused to move. The danger was not inside the old building. It was still looking for her. 3 days earlier, Caleb had driven into the Blue Ridge foothills beneath a sky, the color of hammered tin. Rowan Orchard sat outside a small North Carolina town where the mountains rose in long, blue folds and the roads narrowed between stone walls, pasture fences, and weathered churches. The orchard had belonged to Caleb's family for 4 generations. His grandfather planted the first apple trees after returning from Korea. His father expanded the acreage. His mother added a roadside farm stand and a kitchen where she baked pies for anyone who arrived hungry. Caleb had spent most of his adult life somewhere else. At 43, he had the solid build and careful movements of a man who had carried too many people out of bad places. He had served 22 years in the Army, first as a combat medic, then as a senior instructor who taught younger soldiers how to stay alive when plans failed. A jagged pale line ran from beneath his right ear to the edge of his collar, left by shrapnel from a convoy attack overseas. But the injury people noticed least was the one that changed him most. Caleb no longer slept through the night. He no longer entered a room without locating every exit. And after his final deployment, the Army doctor had used a phrase Caleb hated: medical retirement. To him, it sounded like a polite way of saying he had become unnecessary. Rook disagreed. The 5-year-old Belgian Malinois rode in the passenger seat with his nose angled toward the cracked window, taking in every scent that crossed the road. Dark fawn fur covered his lean frame. A black mask sharpened his alert face. His amber-brown eyes missed very little. Rook had never been trained as a military dog. Caleb had adopted him after a county rescue group found him abandoned near a construction site. But the animal possessed the same quality. Caleb trusted in the best soldiers he had known. He never wasted a warning. When Caleb pulled into the orchard, Elias Carter came out of the packing barn wiping his hands on a canvas apron. Elias was 66, narrow-shouldered, silver-haired, and permanently bent a little forward from decades of pruning trees on hillsides. He had worked beside Caleb's father for nearly 30 years, and had stayed after the funeral because, as he put it, trees don't understand grief. They still need tending. He embraced Caleb with one arm. "You look tired." "You look older," Elias smiled. "That means we're both telling the truth." The farmhouse stood beyond the orchard rows, white paint peeling along the porch rails. The packing shed leaned slightly toward the east. The old cider house sat farther down the slope near a creek, its stone foundation dark with moss. Caleb had not been inside it since his mother died. Before he could lift his duffel from the truck, Rook jumped down, crossed the yard, and stopped. His body went still. His ears turned toward the cider house. Caleb watched him. "What is it?" Rook did not bark. He took 3 slow steps, then stopped again. Elias looked toward the building and exhaled. "I suppose you should meet Miriam." Caleb turned. "Who is Miriam?" Elias removed his cap and rubbed one thumb across the brim. "Woman I found behind St. Luke's 2 weeks ago." The church pantry had closed for the afternoon. She was sitting on the steps with one suitcase, a green book, and a brass key tied around her neck. He paused. "She wouldn't take money, wouldn't let me call anybody. Asked whether I knew a place that still needed hands." Caleb glanced at the cider house. "You brought her here?" "I offered her the spare room beside the pantry. Told her she could sort apples, fold market bags, maybe help in the kitchen. Light work. Elias's mouth tightened. She keeps finding heavy work when nobody's looking. Rook moved again. This time, Caleb followed. The cider house door groaned open beneath his hand. Inside, late afternoon light slipped through narrow windows and cut pale bars across the floor. Old presses stood beneath dust covers. Empty oak barrels lined the wall. The air smelled of apples, cold stone and dry cedar. Near the back, a woman was trying to drag a full produce crate onto a low cart. She was taller than Caleb expected, perhaps 5'7", though her shoulders curled inward as if years of apology had slowly changed her shape. Silver threaded through dark auburn hair, twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She wore a blue chambray shirt beneath a faded gray sweater, a long brown skirt over thick stockings, and old leather shoes polished with almost ceremonial care. Her face still held traces of striking beauty, but her eyes were always moving. Door, window, Caleb, Rook, then the green ledger tucked beneath her arm. "Mrs. Hale?" Caleb asked. She straightened too quickly. "Miriam is fine. I'm Caleb Rowan. I know. Mr. Carter said the orchard belonged to you. It belongs to too many dead Rowans for me to claim all the credit." For half a second, the corner of her mouth lifted. Then she bent for the crate again. Caleb stepped closer. "I'll take that." "No, thank you. It's heavier than it looks. I know exactly how heavy it is." There was no anger in her voice, only fear of owing somebody. Caleb recognized it. He lowered one hand to the side of the crate without pulling it away. Miriam held on. They stayed that way for a moment, each pretending the crate was the only thing being negotiated. Finally, her fingers loosened. As Caleb lifted the weight, her sweater sleeve slid past her elbow. Purple marks wrapped the inside of her wrist, 4 of them, evenly spaced. A thumbprint sat darker below the others. Caleb had treated injuries like that in field hospitals and emergency rooms. They did not come from falling. Miriam saw where he was looking and covered them immediately. "I bruise when the weather changes." Caleb did not challenge the lie. Some people needed truth to arrive as a door, not a demand. He set the crate on the cart. Behind him, Rook entered the cider house at last. The dog crossed the floor slowly and sat beside Miriam. She looked down at him. Rook tilted his head, then leaned one shoulder against her skirt. Miriam's hand hovered above his neck. It trembled when she finally touched him. The dog closed his eyes. No one spoke. A vehicle passed on the road beyond the orchard. Miriam's fingers tightened in Rook's fur until the sound disappeared. That was when Caleb noticed the brass key tied on a cord beneath her collar, and the green ledger pressed so hard against her ribs that its corners had left marks in the fabric. That night, Elias explained only what he knew. Miriam Hale had once owned a roadside lunch counter 20 miles east of the orchard. She and her husband had served country breakfasts, soup, biscuits, and preserves to truck drivers, school teachers, and farmers for more than 30 years. After her husband died, the lunch counter closed. Then Miriam vanished from town life almost completely. Elias had asked no more. "She's not lazy," he said. "I know. She's not confused. I know that too." Elias looked toward the hallway where the pantry room had been prepared. "She hides bread." Caleb said nothing. "She waits until everyone else eats. Then she asks whether she can have what's left." The old man's voice roughened. "I've told her there's enough." Caleb stared into his coffee. Being told you're safe and feeling safe are two different things. Across the room, Rook lay facing the hallway. He did not sleep. The next morning, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows while Elias cooked eggs in a cast-iron skillet. Miriam entered carrying folded dish towels. "I can eat later," she said. Elias pointed toward the table. "You can eat now. I don't mind waiting." Caleb pulled out the chair beside him. "This one's open." Miriam looked at it, then at the hallway, then at the back door. "It may belong to someone. It belongs to whoever sits in it. She remained standing. Rook walked beneath the table, circled once, and settled beside the empty chair. Miriam's face softened. Slowly she sat. Elias filled her plate without ceremony. Eggs, fried apples, one biscuit split open under a spoonful of jam. Conversation stayed harmless. The weather, a broken irrigation line, a black bear that had raided the lower trees. No one asked Miriam where she came from. No one asked who had left the bruises. After breakfast, Caleb carried his cup to the sink and saw her wrap half a biscuit in a napkin. She slid it into her sweater pocket. When she realized he had noticed, her cheeks lost their color. "I'm sorry. For what?" "I should have asked." Caleb dried his hands. "Miriam, food from this table doesn't have to be earned twice." She looked at him as if the sentence belonged to a language she had once known but could no longer speak. Then the green ledger slipped from her lap. It struck the floor and opened. Recipe cards slid beneath the table. Old photographs fanned across the boards. A yellowed menu, a folded church bulletin, several bank receipts, a postcard with a mountain painted on the front, and one photograph of a younger Miriam standing behind a lunch counter beside a laughing man in a white apron. The brass key swung forward from beneath her collar. Miriam dropped to her knees. "No, please." Her breathing turned fast and shallow. Caleb crouched but did not touch the papers. Rook moved first. He picked up the photograph gently by one corner and placed it beside Miriam's hand, then a recipe card, then the postcard. Each time he returned without being told. Miriam watched him with tears filling her eyes. "That was Thomas," she whispered, touching the photograph. "My husband." Caleb sat back on his heels. "What was the place called?" "Hale's Table." Her thumb moved across the image. "Thomas said a person could tell what kind of home you kept by whether there was room for one more chair." Elias turned away from the stove, suddenly busy with nothing. Miriam gathered the remaining papers. "We kept one empty by the window. Somebody always needed it." She closed the ledger. The sound was small, final. "What happened to the restaurant?" Caleb asked gently. Miriam stared at the green cover. "After Thomas died, I could not run it alone." That was all she offered. But one of the bank receipts had landed face up. It showed a withdrawal of $48,000. The account holder was Miriam Hale. The signature beneath it did not look like the handwriting on her recipe cards. Caleb said nothing. Later that afternoon, Miriam insisted on helping in the orchard. Elias gave her a basket and asked her to collect windfall apples from beneath the lower trees. It was easy work, or it should have been. Caleb was repairing a fence when Rook rose from the grass and ran toward the hillside. Miriam had dropped the basket. She stood bent at the waist with one hand pressed against her ribs. Then her knees gave way. Caleb reached her before she hit the ground. At the clinic in town, Dr. Hannah Price examined her for almost an hour. Hannah had grown up in the county and spoke with the steady patience of someone who knew silence could be evidence. After reviewing the x-rays, she pulled a stool closer. "Miriam, I need to tell you what I see." Miriam folded both hands over the green ledger. Hannah continued. "2 ribs were broken at different times and healed without treatment. Your right shoulder has an old tear. Your left wrist was fractured and never set correctly." Miriam stared at the floor. "There are also newer bruises on your upper arms." Caleb remained near the wall. Hannah's voice softened. "Did someone hurt you?" "No." The answer came too quickly. Hannah waited. Miriam swallowed. "I fall." "Did you fall 4 fingers at a time?" Silence filled the room. Miriam's face folded inward, not into tears, into shame. Caleb had seen that expression on soldiers who believed surviving something made them responsible for it. He stepped forward. "This did not begin with you," he said. Miriam looked up. "And it does not become your fault because you stayed alive through it." Her eyes filled. Hannah gave her a card with a private number and explained her options without pressure. Medical documentation, a safe shelter, a confidential advocate, law enforcement, if and when Miriam chose. On the drive back to the orchard, Miriam stared through the passenger window while Rook rested his head across her knees. Near the farmhouse, she finally spoke. "My daughter used to sit in that empty chair." Caleb kept both hands on the wheel. "Rebecca." He waited. "She was a sweet child," Miriam said. "After Thomas died," she said, "I should move in with her and Paul, just for a little while." She said grief made people forgetful. The next words came slowly. "They took my keys first, then my bank card, then my phone." Rook's ears shifted beneath her hand. "Paul said bills confused me. Rebecca said he was only trying to help." Miriam's gaze stayed on the mountains. "I kept thinking if I cooperated, my daughter would become herself again." Caleb understood now. Miriam had not been protecting the man who hurt her. She had been protecting the memory of the little girl her daughter used to be. That kind of hope could become a cage. Back at the orchard, Caleb asked no more questions. But after Miriam went inside, he called Lena Ortiz. Lena was a sheriff's investigator Caleb had known since high school. She had spent 15 years working domestic violence and elder exploitation cases across 3 mountain counties. When he said Miriam's name, Lena became quiet. "I've been trying to find her." Caleb looked toward the kitchen window. "Why?" "A credit union flagged unusual withdrawals. Then somebody filed paperwork claiming she had severe cognitive impairment." "She doesn't." "I know. The physician whose name appears on the form says he never examined her." Caleb's jaw tightened. Lena continued. "There's more. Her house was transferred to her daughter and son-in-law. The lunch counter property was used to secure a business loan. Payments stopped 3 months ago. What happens next? That depends on Miriam." Caleb looked down the hall. Rook had returned to the pantry door and stretched across the threshold. "She's afraid of making the wrong choice." Lena's answer was immediate. "Then don't make it for her." Over the next 2 weeks, life at Rowan Orchard changed in small ways. Caleb repaired the greenhouse behind the farmhouse and asked Miriam to help choose what should grow inside it. At first, she resisted. "I don't know anything about greenhouses." "You know what people eat. That's different." "It's exactly the point." She planted rosemary, wintertime, parsley, and rows of lettuce beneath the old glass roof. She found clay pots in the shed and cleaned them with vinegar. She tied paper labels to each shelf in careful handwriting. Rook followed her everywhere. Not close enough to crowd her, close enough that she never had to look far. One afternoon, the farmhouse filled with the scent of brown sugar, apples, and nutmeg. Elias stopped halfway through sharpening a pruning blade. "That smell ought to be illegal." Caleb looked toward the kitchen. Miriam stood at the counter with flour on her cheek and the green ledger open beside her. She had made apple stack cake from Thomas's recipe. At supper, she cut 3 slices and placed them on plates. Then she carried her own plate to the corner near the pantry door. Caleb looked up. "Where are you going?" "I'm fine here." "There's a chair. I don't want to crowd the table." Elias's fork stopped. Caleb rose, walked to the empty chair beside him, and pulled it back. "Miriam." She did not move. His voice stayed gentle. "This house is not full until everyone is seated." Her hands began to shake. "In Rebecca's house, Paul said I made meals unpleasant. He said old people chew too loudly." Caleb's face hardened, but his voice did not. "So they made you stand." At first, the room seemed to shrink. "Later, I ate after they went upstairs." She stared at the plate. "Some nights they locked the pantry because Paul said I forgot how much food cost." Elias lowered his head. Caleb kept one hand on the chair. He was wrong. Miriam looked at him. "You do not have to earn a place at a table you helped feed." For several seconds she remained still. Then she crossed the room. She sat. Elias passed the beans. Caleb poured tea. No one praised her courage. No one turned the moment into a ceremony. They simply kept eating. Halfway through the meal, Miriam laughed at one of Elias's stories. It was the first time Caleb heard joy arrive before fear could stop it. That same evening, Rook lifted his head beneath the table. A black SUV sat beyond the orchard gate with its lights off. Caleb stepped onto the porch. The vehicle remained for nearly a minute, then it rolled away. Miriam had followed him to the doorway. Her face went white. "That's Paul's car." The green ledger slipped against her chest. Caleb turned. "How did he find you?" She shook her head. But Elias remembered a woman at the farmer's market, asking who had baked the sample cake on his table. He had mentioned Miriam's name without thinking. Caleb's stomach tightened. By midnight, 2 motion cameras covered the lower drive. The front gate had a new lock. Lena arranged extra patrols along the county road. Still, Caleb did not tell Miriam what to do. The next morning, he placed Lena's car beside the green ledger. "When you're ready," he said. Miriam stared at it. "What if Rebecca goes to jail?" "I don't know. What if she hates me?" "I don't know that either." Miriam's voice broke. "She is still my child." Caleb sat across from her. "And you are still a person." That afternoon, Miriam untied the brass key from her neck. She placed it in Caleb's palm. "There is a box at Mountain Ridge Credit Union." Inside the safe deposit room, Miriam inserted the key herself. The metal drawer held no jewelry, no cash, no family silver. It held proof, a copy of the original deed to her house. Letters from the credit union questioning withdrawals. Photographs of bruises dated across 18 months. A small digital recorder. A notebook where Miriam had written every amount Paul forced her to sign for, every threat Rebecca repeated, every night the pantry was locked, and every time she was told she would be declared incompetent if she tried to leave. The last page contained a single sentence. "If I disappear, I did not leave willingly." Miriam covered her mouth. "I wrote that the night before I ran." Lena, standing beside her, did not touch the evidence until Miriam nodded. The digital recorder contained Paul's voice, calm, patient, terrifying. He told Miriam that if she refused to sign the property transfer, he would have her committed before Sunday. Rebecca could be heard in the background saying nothing. Then softly, "Just sign it, Mama. You're making this harder." Miriam closed her eyes. The silence on the recording hurt more than the threat. Lena stopped the device. "We can move forward with this." Miriam's hand tightened around the green ledger. "But you need to understand," Lena said. "The evidence can prove what they did. It cannot choose what you do next." Miriam looked at Caleb. He shook his head once. "Not my choice." For the first time, she seemed disappointed that he would not rescue her from deciding. Then she understood. That was the rescue. 3 days later, cold rain swept across the orchard. Paul's black SUV appeared at the gate just before noon. Caleb stood beneath the packing barn awning. Rook moved beside him. Lena had warned them that Paul and Rebecca might come after being contacted by investigators. She and 2 deputies were already positioned near the equipment barn, out of sight but close. The SUV stopped outside the locked gate. Paul Hale stepped out first. He was 50, broad through the chest, dressed in a charcoal overcoat and polished boots that sank into the mud. His hair was neatly cut. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who believed politeness erased what happened behind closed doors. Rebecca came around the passenger side. She looked younger than Miriam, but older than the photograph in the ledger. Her blonde hair was pinned beneath a wool hat. Her face was drawn and pale. "Mama," she called. Miriam stood on the farmhouse porch. The green ledger was tucked beneath one arm. Paul gripped the gate. "Mrs. Rowan." "Mr. Rowan," Caleb corrected. Paul forced a smile. "Of course. We appreciate you sheltering my mother-in-law, but she's unwell. She gets confused. We're taking her home." Caleb glanced toward Miriam. "She decides where home is." Rebecca stepped forward. "Mama, please, people are asking questions. Paul's business is already suffering." The old reflex passed across Miriam's face. Guilt and fear. Then responsibility for everyone except herself. Paul softened his voice. "We can forget all of this. Come back, sign a statement saying you misunderstood, and we'll fix the finances." Miriam's fingers tightened around the ledger. Rebecca began to cry. "You're destroying our family." The words landed exactly where they were meant to. Miriam stepped off the porch. One step, then another. Caleb did not stop her. Elias did not call her name. Lena remained hidden. Rook walked into the rain and sat halfway between Miriam and the gate, not blocking her, waiting. Miriam stopped beside him. Paul lifted the gate latch, but the new lock held. "Open it," he said. Caleb's voice stayed level. "No. You're interfering with a vulnerable adult." "No, I'm refusing to interfere with one." Paul's mask slipped. "She belongs with her family." Miriam flinched. Caleb looked at her, not Paul. "For years, they told you every chair belonged to someone else." Rain ran from the porch roof. Rook looked up at her. Caleb continued, "This choice belongs to you." Rebecca wiped her face. "Mama, come home." Miriam stared at her daughter. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I loved you before you knew my name." Rebecca's expression crumpled. "I still love you." Miriam drew one slow breath. "But love is not permission to erase me." Paul shook the gate. "This is ridiculous." Miriam stepped backward, then another step. She placed one hand on Rook's head. "I am not going with you." The sentence was quiet. The valley seemed to hear it anyway. Lena and the deputies came into view. Paul turned. Investigator Ortiz opened a folder beneath the awning. "Paul Hale, a magistrate issued warrants this morning, related to financial exploitation, coercion, unlawful restraint, and assault on an elder." Rebecca covered her mouth. Lena looked at her next. "Rebecca Hale, you are being served with a protective order. You are not to contact your mother except through counsel while the investigation continues." Paul began shouting. Caleb heard none of it clearly. Miriam had closed her eyes. Her hand remained on Rook's head. When the SUV and patrol cars finally disappeared down the wet road, she stood at the gate for a long time. Caleb moved beside her. "I thought freedom would feel bigger," she said. "What does it feel like? Terrifying." He nodded. "That sounds about right." She looked back toward the farmhouse. Through the kitchen window, the table was visible. One chair remained pulled out, waiting. Miriam began to cry. Not because she had lost her family, because she had finally stopped losing herself. Winter settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The legal case moved slowly, as such cases often do. Paul remained under court restrictions while investigators traced the loans, withdrawals, and property transfer. Rebecca entered a plea agreement months later that required restitution, counseling, and sworn testimony about the coercion. Miriam did not celebrate. Healing was not revenge. It was the return of ordinary things. Sleeping through the night, eating when she was hungry, leaving a room without asking permission, choosing whether to answer the phone. The farmhouse changed with her. She reopened her green ledger and began writing new recipes between the old ones. Elias repaired the long table her husband had once built for Hale's table. Caleb sanded the surface and reinforced the legs. By spring, they placed it beneath the orchard's biggest apple tree. On Saturdays, Miriam served soup, biscuits, preserves, and whatever fruit was in season. She refused payment. Instead, she asked each visitor to bring one thing: a jar of beans, a loaf of bread, a story, or someone who had been eating alone. People began calling it the open chair table. Farm workers came after market, widows came after church, teenagers came when home felt too loud. A retired mechanic arrived every week with coffee and said almost nothing. Miriam never asked anyone to explain why they needed the empty chair. She simply pulled it out. Caleb returned to physical therapy and began helping a veterans rescue group train shelter dogs, for men and women who were learning how to live at home again. He no longer thought of himself as unnecessary. Rook had settled that argument long before Caleb did. One September morning, Caleb came through the farmhouse door after a week away at a training clinic. The scent of apple butter filled the kitchen. Miriam stood at the stove. Without thinking, Caleb called, "Did you save me a chair?" She turned. Her gray eyes warmed. "Always." The word stopped him, not because it was dramatic, because he believed it. On the shelf behind her, the green ledger rested open instead of locked shut. The brass key lay beside it. Neither was hidden anymore. That evening, the three of them ate beneath the apple tree while sunlight moved gold across the orchard. Elias told a story he had told twice before. Miriam laughed anyway. Caleb watched Rook stretch beneath the long table, his breathing slow, his body loose. Months earlier, the dog had refused to enter a dark cider house because fear lived inside it. Now he slept beneath a table built for anyone who needed a place. For most of her life, Miriam had been told to wait outside the life she helped build. At Rowan Orchard, they pulled out a chair, and she finally sat down.